there's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from being erased. Not with words, not even with violence, but with the kind of glances that look right through you. With locked doors you were never told existed. With questions like, "Can I help you?" when you're not lost. Nova Sinclair was used to being the quietest person in the room, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she learned early on that speaking too soon could cost more than staying silent. Her father taught her that the law was a scalpel, not a sword. Precise, controlled. But on a humid Georgia afternoon, in a town that never quite let go of the past, Nova was forced to learn what happens when the law no longer recognizes your voice, and your silence becomes the only thing left to defend you. What began with a book in her backpack would end with a courtroom holding its breath. So, how does a teenager with no badge, no lawyer, and no spotlight manage to rewrite the rules of justice in a town that never wanted her to speak? Not because she failed to speak, but because she had learned early that silence often spoke louder than anything else in Oak Valley, Georgia. Oak Valley was the kind of place where time had folded in on itself. It had gas stations that still sold boiled peanuts in paper sacks, and front porches where old men rocked in wooden chairs, their hats shadowing years they refused to name. There were churches on every corner, but the kind of grace they preached didn't always stretch across skin tones. Nova had lived there all 16 years of her life. She knew the back roads by memory, could name the grocer's son and the mayor's third wife. But on a humid Thursday afternoon in late April, she realized she didn't know Oak Valley at all. It started with a book. More precisely, a weathered copy of Federal Civil Procedure, Principles and Practice she had borrowed from the town's underfunded library. She tucked it neatly into her canvas bag, along with some printed scholarship applications and a black leather notebook, the kind her father once carried everywhere before his name was reduced to a plaque on a courthouse bench. Nova's plan was simple. Walk 2 blocks to Murphy's bookstore to find a used LSAT prep guide, then head home to help her mom with dinner. It was supposed to be quiet, controlled. Instead, it unraveled the moment she stepped through the bookstore door. She didn't see him at first, Officer Greg Talcott, sitting near the soda fridge, stirring sugar into his coffee like he owned the whole damn street. But he saw her bag, saw her skin, saw her hair twisted into tight coils that defied gravity, and screamed, "I belong to no one's definition but my own." He didn't speak until she moved past him. "Afternoon," he said with a nod that wasn't a greeting, more like a checkpoint. "Afternoon," she replied, not slowing down. "You in school today?" "I'm homeschooled," Nova answered politely, eyes still on the bookshelf. "What's in the bag?" She paused. "Books," she said, careful not to sound annoyed. "From the library." He stood up, walked over slowly, smiled in that way Southern white men sometimes did when they wanted to make it clear the conversation wasn't casual anymore. "Mind if I take a look?" "I do, actually," she replied. "You don't have probable cause, sir." His smile flattened. "You got a mouth on you, huh?" Nova inhaled. "I know my rights." "You sure you know where you are?" That question hung in the air like humidity. Heavy, sticky. Not really a question at all. Then came the moment she would replay 1,000 times in her head. The grab at her shoulder. The hand yanking her bag open. The papers spilling onto the tile floor, applications, scholarship drafts, her father's notes in the margins of a civil rights article. Her body frozen. Her voice buried in the back of her throat. And then, the cuffs. Cold metal on warm skin. Tight, public, undeniable. He didn't read her rights, didn't explain the charge, just radioed in something about resisting interaction, and walked her out of the store like she'd tried to steal more than a future. The sidewalk felt louder than ever. People stared not out of concern, but curiosity. Some lowered their heads. Others looked straight through her. No one asked what happened. No one offered to help. The clerk from the bookstore locked the door behind them. Nova didn't cry. Not then. She just listened to the sound of the handcuffs clicking tighter as the officer said, almost offhand, "Gotta keep these kids in line somehow." He didn't mean kids. He didn't mean in line, and Nova knew it. When the patrol car door closed behind her, the world muffled like being buried alive under someone else's version of the truth. She could smell the old leather, the faint trace of sweat from whoever had sat in that seat last. The seatbelt was broken. The window had a crack running through it, like it had tried to break free and failed. Nova leaned her head back and stared at the roof of the car. It was happening. Not on a protest sign, not in a documentary, but to her, Nova Sinclair, daughter of Elijah Sinclair, a man who once overturned a racial conviction that made headlines across the South. A man who taught her to read law books before bedtime and told her every black child needed to understand their rights before they could dream. And now she sat in the back of a patrol car, cuffed for carrying that very knowledge. It wasn't just the injustice. It was the betrayal. Because deep down, she had believed just a little that if she was smart enough, calm enough, well-spoken enough, she could pass through this country without collision. But Oak Valley didn't forget, didn't forgive, didn't care. At the station, they didn't log her in properly, didn't contact her mother, just placed her in a holding cell labeled Temp Juvenile, Female, and left the light buzzing overhead like a reminder. This is where belief in the system gets you. Nova sat on the metal bench, back straight, jaw clenched. Her bag lay on a table outside the cell, contents still scattered. No one offered her water. No one explained anything. She was 16, but they didn't see that. They saw a threat. Not because of what she did, but because of what she could become. Somewhere between the 5th and 6th hour, she reached for her pendant, a small, steel locket her father gave her before he died. Inside wasn't a picture. It was a tiny voice recorder chip, embedded by her tech-savvy cousin. Her father used to say, "The truth is quiet. That's why you have to keep it safe." She had pressed it the moment Talcott touched her shoulder. Now she had it. Proof. But in that moment, the weight of justice didn't comfort her. It hurt, because she realized she still needed proof to be believed. And still, no one had told her what she was being charged with. 12 hours earlier, she was planning her essay on judicial ethics. Now she sat in silence, bathed in flickering light, in a town that taught her perhaps for the first time that brilliance meant nothing without power. And her power, for now, was still locked away in a folder, on a floor, next to a badge that thought it was untouchable. But Nova wasn't broken. Not yet. Because beneath the surface, beneath the fear, the humiliation, the erasure, something else was building. A silence that didn't come from shame, but from something far more dangerous. Clarity. Time did not move in hours inside the Oak Valley precinct. It moved in flickers. The buzz of a fluorescent bulb overhead that blinked every 17 seconds. The metallic hum of a vending machine down the hallway. The occasional laugh, not cruel, just careless, from the other side of the wall. As if the people working there had forgotten a 16-year-old black girl was sitting alone in a cell designed to break patience before it ever tested strength. Nova Sinclair counted the sounds. It was the only way to hold on to something real. There were no clocks, no windows. The only daylight she saw was the reflection of herself in the scratched metal toilet across from the bench. Her reflection looked smaller than she expected, not weak, just paused, like someone had pressed a button on her life and walked away. She hadn't spoken in hours. No one had asked her to. There were officers walking past her cell who hadn't even glanced her way. One of them, a younger white officer with trembling hands, had slowed down just enough to make eye contact, but kept walking. His silence stung more than Talcott's threats, because it told her what she already knew. They all knew, and no one cared enough to stop it. What Nova hadn't known, what clawed at her slowly now, was how much faith she had placed in systems she barely understood. Not the law. She knew the law. But the people. She thought someone would have said something by now, that there'd be a call, a knock, her mother's voice yelling from the lobby, something to pierce this long, echoing silence. But the truth was, she'd been disappeared. Quietly, efficiently, like a file misplaced on purpose. And somewhere outside that steel door, her mother, Camille Sinclair, high school English teacher, widow, backbone, was probably tearing through every phone book and precinct she could reach, demanding answers no one was paid to give. Nova pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her forehead against them. She remembered her father's voice. Silence is a strategy, baby girl, but don't confuse it with surrender. He used to say that when she came home, frustrated from school, when teachers underestimated her, or when kids mimicked her father's courtroom voice behind her back. Elijah Sinclair believed in law like some men believe in church. It wasn't about winning. It was about knowing when to speak, when to wait, when to let silence do the cutting. But this wasn't strategy, this was exile. And Nova could feel the weight of it in her spine, her joints, the back of her throat. At one point, an older female officer brought her a lukewarm cup of water and placed it on the ground without a word. Nova thanked her. The woman didn't answer, just walked away, like she was afraid language might make her complicit. The water sat untouched. Nova knew this tactic. She had read about it in cases her father used to review at the dinner table. Psychological disorientation. No clocks, no charges, no explanations. It wasn't about physical harm. It was about erosion, wearing down certainty, until the victim begins to rewrite their own memory. But they had miscalculated. Because Nova had spent her whole life studying how people miscalculate her. She knew where she was, she knew what had happened, and she knew it would not be forgotten. The locket around her neck felt heavier than usual, not from weight but from what it held. She could feel the micro-recorder still running, could imagine the captured audio of Talcott's voice, of her own stunned breathing, of the moment her body hit the patrol car seat. And yet, it still didn't feel like enough. Because part of her, the part still clinging to belief, kept whispering, "They won't listen. They never do." The recorder might prove she didn't resist. But could it prove she didn't deserve to be watched? Could it erase the look in Talcott's eyes? Could it undo the fear her mother must be feeling right now? She didn't know anymore. She pressed her fingers together, hard, until they ached. The physical sensation reminded her that she was still in control of something. She counted backward from 200. She recited the Bill of Rights under her breath. She played a memory in her head over and over the last night she and her father sat on the back porch, drinking sweet tea in silence. He had turned to her and said, "One day, someone's going to try to shut you up because your words are sharper than their weapons. When that happens, don't make noise. Make history." She had smiled, unsure if he meant it literally. Now she understood. Noise wouldn't save her here, but precision might. She stood up slowly, walked to the cell door, and knocked once. Not frantic, not desperate, just deliberate. A female officer opened the metal slot. "What?" "I'd like to speak with my guardian," Nova said calmly. "I have the right to one phone call." The officer scoffed. "You're not charged yet." "Then I'm being held unlawfully," Nova said. "And you're violating Georgia State Juvenile Code 1511-6.2. The officer blinked. Nova didn't break eye contact. "I'll see what I can do," the woman muttered, closing the slot. Nova sat back down, her heart thudding like a judge's gavel in her chest. She didn't expect anything to happen, but she had spoken, not shouted, not begged, spoken in the language of those who underestimated her. And that did something. 10 minutes later, she heard it. The sound of hurried footsteps. Then a door creaked open down the hallway. Then her mother's voice, raw, hoarse, beautiful. "Where is my daughter?" Nova's breath caught. Then a man's voice trying to be firm. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. You had her here for 12 hours without a call, without a charge, without counsel. If you don't let me see her right now, I will call every journalist who owes my husband a favor." Silence. Then, the cell door opened. Camille Sinclair stood there, one hand gripping a folder, the other clenching her purse strap so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Nova didn't move. Neither did her mother. And in that stillness, that sacred, stretched moment, the lie broke. The lie that Nova had been alone. The lie that no one was coming. The lie that black mothers wait quietly. Camille stepped forward, wrapped her daughter in the kind of hug that said, "We're not done here." And Nova, for the first time in 12 hours, exhaled. Not relief. Readiness. Because she knew now that this silence, this unbearable, manipulated, weaponized silence, was not just a punishment. It was a test. And she was still standing. The first thing Nova felt when she walked out of the precinct wasn't freedom. It was the weight of the sky. The clouds above Oak Valley had gathered low and gray, as if the town itself wasn't sure whether to hold its breath or burst into storm. Her wrists still bore faint red lines where the cuffs had chafed. She moved her fingers slowly, checking, confirming that they still belonged to her. Her mother didn't speak. Neither did Nova. They simply walked one step at a time, past the whispering officers, past the clerk who suddenly avoided eye contact, past the front desk where Nova's name had never been logged. When they reached the sidewalk, Camille finally exhaled. "You're not going back to silence," she said softly. Nova didn't respond. She just nodded. That night, the town of Oak Valley slept as if nothing had happened. But inside the Sinclair home, a modest, brick-frame house with books stacked on every surface, something began to stir. Nova opened her laptop. She placed the locket beside it, and for the first time, she played the recording back. "What's in the bag? You got a mouth on you, huh? You sure you know where you are?" Unzipping, papers hitting floor. Hands behind your back. "Let's keep these kids in line." No warning, no Miranda, just a girl, a book, and a badge. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did her mother. By morning, they had clipped the audio, dated the files, drafted a timeline. Camille contacted an attorney, a former mentee of Elijah Sinclair, and by mid-afternoon, they had filed a motion demanding public accountability and a full suppression hearing in juvenile court. But that wasn't enough. Nova didn't want a quiet correction. She wanted it on record. She wanted the courtroom. She wanted the system to stare her in the face and hear itself out loud. 2 weeks later, she got her wish. Oak Valley Juvenile Court rarely had media coverage. Most of its cases were sealed, handled swiftly, designed to preserve reputations rather than truth. But someone had leaked. By the time Nova stepped into that courtroom, the benches were full. Local news vans lined the street. Teachers from her old public school sat in the back row. Reverend Darnell from Third Baptist was there. Even Talcott's wife had shown up, eyes tight with something between shame and disbelief. Nova's hands didn't shake. She wore a gray blazer too big for her shoulders, her father's. Camille had kept it pressed all these years. The sleeves fell past her wrists, but the weight grounded her. Judge Whitman, a pale man in his 60s, with watery blue eyes, leaned forward from the bench. "Miss Sinclair, I've reviewed the motion to suppress the arrest record. I understand you intend to speak directly before this court?" "Yes, Your Honor," Nova said. Her voice was low, steady, almost too calm for a girl accused of suspicious presence and failure to comply. Whitman raised an eyebrow. "You're representing yourself?" "She has prepared remarks," Camille interjected. "And legal documentation. We've filed the forms." Whitman sighed, glanced at the stack of papers. "Proceed." Nova stepped forward. The room quieted. She looked not at the judge but at the crowd. "I was arrested for carrying a book," she began. "Not because the book was stolen, not because it was a threat, but because it was written in a language this town doesn't expect girls like me to speak." Someone shifted in their seat. "I was held for 12 hours without charge, without contact, without cause. And in those 12 hours, I wasn't a student. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't even a minor. I was a problem." She paused. "Let that word hang." Then, "The officer claimed I resisted. I didn't. I recorded the entire interaction." Gasps rippled through the back rows. "I present audio evidence," she continued, holding up a USB drive. "The arrest was unlawful. The language used was coercive. The force was unprovoked. Judge Whitman gestured to the clerk. The drive was collected. In addition, Nova said, this court must understand the larger issue. This isn't about one officer's poor judgment. It's about a pattern of perception. That when you're young, black, and unafraid to know your rights, you become dangerous, even if you're holding nothing but paper. There it was. The truth. Said plainly, publicly. Judge Whitman leaned back, lips pursed. The silence that followed wasn't oppressive this time. It was reverent. Nova stepped back. Camille touched her hand. Her eyes were glassy, but proud. The prosecutor, a tired-looking man with salt in his beard, stood but didn't contest the evidence. He simply said, "We have no objection to the motion." Judge Whitman nodded. Motion granted. All charges are dismissed. But Nova wasn't done. "Your Honor," she said, "with permission, I request that this hearing transcript be made part of public record." Whitman hesitated. "That's irregular." Nova held his gaze. "So is being arrested for reading." A beat. Then, "Granted." Afterward, people stood in the hallway, unsure whether to approach her or leave her alone. Some nodded. Some offered handshakes. One woman cried. Talcott never showed up. But the next day, he was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. By Friday, he resigned. And on Monday, Nova returned to Murphy's bookstore. She walked in slowly, deliberately. The same clerk was there. He pretended not to see her. Nova didn't mind. She wasn't there for acknowledgement. She walked to the back, pulled a copy of the Constitution of the United States, and placed it on the counter. No words, just the quiet exchange of truth. That night, at home, Nova opened her father's case file from his final trial. Inside was a sticky note, faded ink, Elijah's handwriting. "They won't hand you the mic, so build your own stage." Nova closed the file, smiled, and reached for a blank notebook. It would have been easy to make noise. Offers came in almost immediately. Interview requests, podcast invites, blog articles titled "The Girl Who Beat the System." Even a documentary filmmaker from Atlanta reached out, asking if Nova would consider retelling her story for a broader audience. But Nova declined every single one, not out of fear, but because something deeper had taken root in her. After the courtroom victory, there was no celebration, no streamers, no champagne, just her mother's arms around her in the kitchen, a bowl of warm gumbo on the stove, and a quiet that felt earned. "Your father would have been proud," Camille said that night. Nova didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she wasn't sure if pride was what she wanted. She wanted prevention. It started with a question. One that came surprisingly from someone she never expected, Mr. Reyes, the guidance counselor at her old middle school. He had called, cautiously, to say that another student, a 12-year-old named Jeremiah, had been suspended for non-compliance. The boy had refused to hand over his notebook during a routine locker check, citing his right to privacy. Instead of being praised for knowing his rights, he was branded defiant. "I don't know who else to call," Mr. Reyes admitted. "He mentioned you by name, said you were his hero." Nova paused, and something inside her shifted. By the end of that week, Nova was meeting with 3 students in the back of the public library, using leftover whiteboard markers and a donated law school prep guide. It wasn't flashy. The kids didn't always understand the vocabulary, but they listened. And more importantly, they felt heard. Word spread. By month's end, she had a regular group of 10 students. Some were middle schoolers, with too many detentions and not enough defenders. Others were high schoolers who had been labeled problematic simply because they asked too many questions. All of them had one thing in common. They were searching for the language to justify their existence. Nova didn't teach them to argue. She taught them to read, to interpret, to demand clarity when someone in power spoke in half-truths. She gave them tools, not slogans. And slowly, a different kind of strength emerged. One afternoon, a girl named Kiara raised her hand. "What if they still don't listen?" she asked. "Even when we're right?" Nova looked at her, long and hard. "Then you document everything," she said. "You record, you write, you let the paper outlive the moment." Kiara nodded, eyes sharper now. That night, Nova opened her journal and wrote down something her father once told her, but she had never quite understood until now. Not every battle is won in public. Some victories are built in the spaces where the system isn't looking. Eventually, people began to notice. The public defender's office reached out, asking if Nova would be willing to help design a Know Your Rights seminar for youth in juvenile detention. The school board sent a letter cautiously worded, requesting her input on revising their student conduct code. Even the mayor's assistant called, inquiring whether she'd consider serving on the town's new Equity and Oversight Committee. Nova didn't say yes to everything. She chose carefully. She had no interest in titles or tokenism. What she wanted was proximity. To the kids, to the families, to the places where injustice seeped in so slowly, so quietly, that no one noticed until someone like Talcott turned it into thunder. She kept showing up. No cameras, no applause. Just her, a stack of books, and a belief that systems could be rewritten one footnote at a time. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, just her name in clean block letters. Inside was a single page, typed, "Miss Sinclair, I don't expect forgiveness. I doubt I've earned it. But you should know I've resigned from law enforcement permanently. I've started attending counseling, and I've enrolled in a restorative justice training program in Savannah. Not for show, because I saw what I did to you. And I saw how you didn't become what I expected. You could have destroyed me publicly. Instead, you built something stronger than vengeance. I don't deserve your grace, but I thank you for showing it anyway. E.T." Nova read it once, then again, and then folded it carefully, sliding it between the pages of her father's old law textbook. Not as closure, but as evidence. That transformation was possible even if it came from those who never deserved a second chance. One evening, as she locked up the library room, Camille appeared in the doorway. "You've been quiet lately," she said, smiling. Nova shrugged. "Busy?" "I know," Camille said, stepping forward. "But just remember, the world might be watching now. Doesn't mean you owe it anything." Nova looked at her mother, her eyes older than her age, her shoulders squared not from confidence but from clarity. "I know," she said, "but this time I'm not doing it for them." And that was the truth. Nova wasn't driven by applause. She didn't need headlines. What she needed, what she had built, was a space, a room, a sanctuary for voices like hers. And in that quiet corner of Oak Valley, change wasn't declared. It was lived, one whisper at a time. The first time they unlocked the doors, no one noticed. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no mayoral speech, no photo ops. Just a creaky brass key, a faded wooden sign, and a girl in a navy cardigan holding a box of donated books. The building had once been a storage annex for the county records office, abandoned for years, overtaken by dust and silence. But now, it bore a new name carved in soft oak above the doorway: the Sinclair Center for Justice and Learning. Inside were no glass walls, no marble plaques, just shelves, tables, chairs that didn't match. And most importantly, a long, scarred conference table, salvaged from a courthouse renovation, where 10 students could sit shoulder to shoulder and learn the language of their own liberation. Nova called it the room, but for those who stepped into it, it became a threshold. The students came slowly at first, curious, skeptical. Many of them had never been asked what they wanted to learn. They were used to rules, not invitations. But Nova's first lesson was simple. She handed each of them a blank card and said, Write the last time you were told you were wrong, even though you were right. At first, there was hesitation, then scribbles, then silence, and then tears. Because for many of them, no one had ever acknowledged that pain. It had been swallowed, twisted into self-doubt, buried in suspensions and side-eyes. But now it had a place, a name, a witness. And week by week, as the cards turned into journals and the journals turned into stories, Nova watched something bloom. It wasn't fast, but it was real. One afternoon, a boy named Zaire stood up. He had barely spoken in 3 sessions, but this time, his voice didn't shake. "I wanna be a lawyer," he said quietly. "Not to argue, but to protect kids like my sister. They treat her like she's loud. She's not loud, she's scared." Nova didn't say a word. She just handed him a copy of Gideon's Trumpet, bookmarked with a sticky note that read, "You don't need a suit to defend someone. You need the truth and the will to speak it." Zaire clutched the book like it was armor. And in that moment, Nova realized this wasn't just her story anymore. A year passed. Then, 2. Nova graduated with honors from Clark Prep. She declined early admission offers to elite colleges, choosing instead to stay in Oak Valley, attending a local university part-time while continuing her work at the center. The media eventually moved on, but the work deepened. They held restorative justice circles, mock trial simulations, even family advocacy workshops where parents could learn how to protect their kids in encounters with police or school boards. The room became more than a classroom. It became a sanctuary, and eventually a movement. Then, on a rain-heavy Sunday, Camille brought in a wooden box from the attic. Inside were relics: her father's bar exam results, a cracked fountain pen, and at the bottom a letter, sealed. It was addressed, "To Nova, when you're ready to build." She opened it slowly. Her father's handwriting curved across the page, steady even in fading ink. "Nova, if you're reading this, then you've stepped into something bigger than survival. You're building. And builders must remember, you don't have to shout to shake the ground. You just have to stand still long enough for others to gather around you. I know you will, because you always listened even when the world refused to. And one day, there will be a room with your name on it. Not because you demanded it, but because someone walked in and finally felt seen." "Dad." Nova folded the letter gently. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The room was already here. Years later, long after the walls were repainted and the library grew too full for its shelves, a little girl walked into the Sinclair Center holding a tattered notebook. She didn't say much, but she sat in the corner, opened the first page, and wrote one line. "My brother says I don't talk enough, but I listen. I always listen." Nova watched her quietly, heart thudding, then placed a soft hand on the girl's shoulder and whispered, "Good, that means you're ready to lead." And in that moment, not with applause, but with purpose, the room bore its name once more, not just for Nova, but for every child who had ever been silenced and chose to speak anyway, for every battle fought with paper instead of fists, for every story that didn't make the headlines but changed a life. This wasn't legacy. This was living proof that quiet can be power, that dignity needs no audience, and that the most radical act, sometimes, is staying. Have you ever been in a room where no one saw you, where your voice felt too small, your silence too loud, and the weight of being misunderstood unbearable? Nova Sinclair didn't start out wanting to change anything. She just wanted to be left alone, to read, to think, to exist. But the world asked her to prove herself again and again, not with rage, but with quiet courage. And maybe that's the story we often forget to tell. That change doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply stay and build. If this story moved something in you, even just a little, I want to hear about it. Have you ever felt invisible in a space that should have protected you? What did you do with that silence? Leave a comment. Share this episode with someone who might need it. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, because these are the stories we carry together. You don't have to shout to shake the ground. That's what Nova's father said. And in the end, that's exactly what she did. See you in the next story. Stay tuned.